welcome everyone. I'm so excited that you could come join us on this webinar all about college standardized testing. I'm really excited. I have Ms. Jenny Cochran here from our friends over at ArborBridge Test Prep. They are my preferred test prep company. I recommend them for all of my students from here in North America all the way around the world to all my international students. They are the very best at what they do. And I will mention what I especially like about what they do is because I work with so many athletes, they're able to really work a lot with scheduling. So a lot of my students don't have time to go to a once or twice a week class and sit there for 2-3 hours at a time. So I like the fact that the tutoring can be really tailored to each student and help them wherever they're at. So some might be starting at a lower point and need to hit a certain number. Some might be starting actually fairly high, but they're still needing to hit some higher numbers for recruitment, for scholarship, and obviously for admission. So there's a lot of different reasons. Those are all things that we work alongside each other quite a bit. So I'm really excited to have Jenny here talk about there's some changes, some stuff. Test prep is always, if it does anything, it's always keeping us on our toes. So Jenny, I will throw it over to you. I don't know if you want to give yourself a little intro, and then we can, Jenny has some slides here that she is going to share. So we will just go from there, and I will be monitoring the Q&A. And, it's a bit of a smaller group tonight. So, definitely if you have those questions, pop those in there. We want to make sure we answer them this evening. So, all right, Jen, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for coming, or if you're listening to this later, test prep is an extremely dynamic landscape that we are dealing with right now. So I'm going to give you as much information as I can in the shortest amount of time. I told Karen that I want this to be interactive. So the minute you have a question, please pop it in there. She'll interrupt me and let's get it answered for you right away. My job is just to give you the information you need, not what I think you need necessarily. So I'm the director of partnerships at ArborBridge. It is my sole responsibility to support counselors such as Karen. ArborBridge is a totally online digital tutoring company. We're actually a tech company. So the beauty of that, like Karen was saying, is that we have tutors all over the world in all different time zones. So we're extremely flexible and we can literally pick the best tutors because we can pick from all over the world. Just a side note, our tutors all have to score in the 99th percentile on the tests every year. So I do not, luckily, but they do. So I'm going to get started just because I really want to honor everyone's time. Let me pull up my slides. Sorry about that. So tonight I want to talk about the SAT. I know that it's been around for a year. But I just want to give you an overview because the digital portion of it is a little bit different. I'm going to talk about the changes to the ACT that are actually coming tomorrow in April, the timeline to the new test, because there's different dates that you should be aware of as we lead up to the final version of it in September of 2025. I'll give you our recommendations as test prep experts on how you should navigate these changes. And something Karen asked me to do, which I think is super smart, is to give you some testing timelines, meaning how long should you study for a test? When should you be taking the PSAT? When should you be taking the SAT? So just kind of giving you an idea when your students should be thinking about taking these tests, and then backtracking to when you should start preparing. And then we can do some questions and answers at the end as well. So I want to talk the basics of the SAT. It went digital in 2024, so we've collected a lot of data from the last year. It was an extremely successful launch. Happens to be a more popular test right now. The content of the SAT, similar to the PSAT, is tied to knowledge and skills that the students are learning in high school. Reading passages are shorter than they used to be, about one paragraph, tied to a single question. Calculators are allowed on all math questions. They do have a calculator built into the SAT, and I do want to touch on this a little bit tonight. It's called Desmos, and it's a company that they've contracted with. This Desmos graphing calculator that's built into the SAT can help raise scores significantly if your student knows how to use it. So a lot of students just don't know how to use it, so they're bringing in their own calculator. But we have collected a lot of data that if we can even show your student in one 30-minute tutoring session, if we can show them how to use Desmos, that they will improve their math score simply by using this tool. It's a fantastic tool. It really can lead students to the correct answer in half the time. So that's something that I'm happy to talk about a little bit further. The adaptive test. So SAT went from being a straight test to an adaptive test, which means that there's modules. So in reading and writing and in math, your student will start with module 1. It's 27 questions on reading and writing, 22 for math. It's a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. Based on how they answer those questions, they will either be put into a lower module or a higher module. And here's what's really important about that. We don't know how many questions exactly they have to get right to go into the higher module, which is usually students' goals, but we have collected enough data that it's around 22. So anything below 22, your student might be put into the lower module. It's okay, but I'll tell you that it does mess with your student's head. They know which module they were put in. They can tell by the first question. If a student goes into the lower module, it does affect their score. So instead of 800 points, which is the total they could get on the reading and writing section, they can only get a total of 500 to 600. So the total score will be affected, meaning their cumulative score might only get up to a 1200. So the goal for a lot of students is to get into that higher module. And that is kind of where companies such as ArborBridge come in. We strategize. We don't teach content as much as we teach strategy. So we've gone through these module ones, and we've determined which questions are going to be the most heavily weighted so that your student will focus on those questions. So we're all just trying to get the needle to move faster. Like, we're not the teachers. We're not trying to reteach this content, but we're going to teach the strategy for the student if it's their goal to get above a 1200, to get into those higher modules. And then we'll attack that higher module as well. So I know that's a little bit confusing. If there's any questions, let me know. I think that test anxiety, when it comes to getting into these modules, we have noticed, we've collected a lot of data from students. It does happen as soon as a student realizes they're in that lower module, some anxiety can kick in. But that's something that we work on with our students as well. We have a lot of tools for that, like, okay, you got the lower module today. Let's take this test. Let's knock it out of the park in these modules, and then maybe we'll plan for a new test. It's not the end of the world to get a 1200 either. It's a very good score. Okay, digital ACT is changing. The current ACT is still out, as well as this month we'll see a new version of the ACT. I'm going to go through what the differences are, and then I'm going to tell you when you're going to see them. So the old ACT is 3 hours long. The new one's 2. They're trying to answer, what SAT did by making theirs shorter as well. Right
By the
now,
way, this timing sounds so great. Like, I feel like a
yes.
2-hour test sounds so much easier to wrap your brain around. Like, I felt so bad for the students when you're sitting there like, oh my gosh, you're sitting there all morning, doing a test.
Yes.
Anyway, the 2 hours sound
Yes.
amazing.
Yes. And with brain science, actually with adolescents, that this makes a lot more sense to ask an adolescent, a young adult, to sit for 2 hours versus 3.5, right? So it is. It's just smart all the way around. So here's where they're cutting out questions. Instead of an average of 4 sections making up your total score, it used to be English, reading, math, and science. It's just going to be the English, reading, and math. So for the new ACT, science is becoming optional. I will tell you that they made this decision without consulting colleges. So right now, and I'll talk about this later, we are suggesting and recommending pretty heavily that all of your students, if they take the new ACT, still take that science optional section. Because we haven't heard from the college admissions professionals yet that they don't want to see science, especially if your student is testing into some STEM programs. So the cadence, the passages were a lot longer. on the English and reading sections, and now they're a lot shorter. There's less, the current ACT had less time per question, which a lot of students that make quicker decisions enjoyed. They're actually going to have more time per question. I think it used to be that they had like 6 seconds per question, and now they're going to have 8, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in the testing world. Here's a timeline. In December, they opened up the registration for these digital tests. There's not a lot of them. They're pretty hard to find right now, we're noticing. But in April, starting tomorrow, they will have some Saturday and Sunday new ACT tests available. Some students I know are traveling 200, 300 miles to go take it. It's not something I recommend, and I'll talk about why. But it is also the first time that science will be offered as an option instead of required. Now, this is also in April. The classic, we're calling it the classic ACT, is still available. So if your student prefers the ACT, this old 3-hour paper-based ACT, to the SAT, we say go for it. Like, this test has been around for decades. The college admissions people know it. They know how to evaluate it. They know how to evaluate your student with that score. So from April 2025 all the way to September of 2025, you can still take the, we're calling it the OG, the original ACT. You still have that available. After September 2025, only this new digital version will be available. And in 2026, all the school day testing will change to the digital as well. So this, I'm kind of just going to go through this quickly. These are kind of all the concerns that we have. There's very limited digital registration options. A couple pilots that they've done recently had a lot of tech hiccups. There were students that showed up that didn't have enough devices, and they were turned away. Like I said, colleges weren't consulted about these changes, especially the optional science section. So we really don't know what admission professionals are thinking about this new test because they haven't seen it yet. The ACT has not released a single practice test yet to show us as test prep experts or families, like, what is this going to look like? So students are going into this April test kind of blind. They don't really know what to expect. The current test they have on their website just mimics the red book, a red book that you can get. That's all they did was cut it in half. It's not, ACT has said that the practice test that they have on their website is not indicative of the new test. So please just don't be fooled by that. They just removed questions without going adaptive, which makes us wonder what the scoring report's going to look like. And then ACT is claiming that their composite scores with science, right? So you take the original classic with science, and then you take one without science on the shorter digital, and they're saying they're comparable. But I'll tell you that admissions professionals are just scratching their heads like they don't understand how those are apples to apples. So it's just so many questions out there. And if admission professionals have them, then we should all be having them as well. I'm going to go that. Test accommodations is something that's all the same. I just wanted, if there's anybody listening or anybody on here tonight whose student needs accommodations, they're basically all going to be the same. No accommodations have been taken away. No new accommodations have been added. Extended time is still available. Rest breaks are available. Screen reader, text to speech for dyslexia example is still available. Separate testing environments for people that need a quieter environment is still available. And so the SAT, they're allowing students to use their own devices. The ACT, they are not ready for that yet. So the devices are going to be whatever's in-house, whatever they have at that testing location. So here are our recommendations. Avoid the April option, quite possibly the May option. Focus on the SAT or focus on the paper ACT up until July. We feel like your students shouldn't be the guinea pig for this project. So come July, we feel like they'll have most of the bugs worked out. And then we feel like this might be a really decent test to take. Test prep companies will have time to get their tutors up and running. Teachers and counselors at school will have been able to see it and take it. So we think July would be a good time to start planning if your student really wants to take that test. Or we're also saying just consider it an add-on. So if you've already taken the ACT, the original, and you've taken the SAT, and you want to just see what you would do on this new digital test, we say go ahead. It could just be an add-on.
Mm.
And then for your classes of 2027 and 2028, we're just kind of saying wait for more details. The earliest that we recommend students take these tests, or even a diagnostic test to see how they do, is in the spring of their sophomore year. So we're just saying, just wait a little bit more. Okay, I hope I'm not going too fast for everyone.
No, you're good. I've been checking, so there haven't been any questions or anything.
Okay, good. This is a good group so far, if they're following me.
Are you able to shrink your screen? So like this one, I can barely see ninth grade. Are you able to like make that?
I'm sure I can. Let's see. Yes. Is it shrinking?
Yes, a little bit more, just so I can see it.
I don't know if that's going to go anymore. How's that?
Better.
Is that a little bit better?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, sorry about that.
it's
I'll have
okay.
to take a look at that. Okay, so practice tests. Practice tests, we're talking about the pre-SAT. Some students are taking that in the 8th and 9th grade. More often, students are taking that their sophomore year, spring of sophomore year. The PSAT is a great indicator of how your student could possibly do on the SAT with more content-based instruction in school. There's a pre-ACT that some schools are giving in the spring of the sophomore year as well. And then there's also another PSAT that a lot of schools, I know more on the West Coast, give the PSAT in October. That's all leading up to junior year, where we suggest that your student take a diagnostic, and Karen can talk to you about that. ArborBridge offers a free diagnostic test for your student, so she can sign you up. It's like I said, it's free. It goes to my operations department, who will send you and Karen a report on how you did. Even better about that is you can get on the phone with one of our directors who can walk you through the results and just say, here's the areas for growth. You can decide at that point if you'd like to talk about tutoring, or you can just decide to do some on your own. But I'll tell you that diagnostic plan is such a great tool for you to enter into your junior year and start making your test prep plan. Junior year winter, we start prepping for the test. Start prepping 2 to 3 months before you take a test. Prep for about 20 to 30 hours. Take about 3 practice tests. Karen, this might be something I can send you too, so you can have the paper of this. About midway through winter of junior year is a good time to take the ACT in February or April, or the SAT in March or May. It's great to get that first test done there. And then junior year spring, like we were talking about at the beginning of the webinar, that's when we really start to see students taking most of their tests. So we say continue prepping. You've got your first test behind you. You know where you need to grow. Work another 4 to 6 weeks, 10 hours. Take about 1 to 2 practice tests, and then get ready to take your test number 2. We do at ArborBridge suggest, if you haven't reached your goal score, that 3 tests is kind of the key. We don't suggest more than 3. 3 is really where we see the most improvement. We don't see a lot of improvement after 3 tries. So continue prepping for another 4 to 6 weeks. Put in another 10 hours of studying, another 1 and 2 practice tests, and then you can sign up for the ACT in September, October, December, and the SAT in October, November, December.
And then I was just gonna make a note because obviously a lot of the students, I'm working with our athletes. For a lot of them, we actually might slide this timeline up, and that might be something we would discuss. I mean, obviously, we're not going to put someone in a situation where they can't be successful, but For most athletes, especially if you're going to be a recruit, that test number three can't be in December, right? Like
Mm,
typically you're going to commit to a school, all that stuff would happen, kind of at the very beginning of senior year. So if possible, we want to try to have, if you do need to take it twice, three times, you ideally want to have that final test September, maybe October at the latest, but we
mm,
definitely don't want to start getting into November, December. It The way I look, it's not that a coach won't take a student, but it's harder, right? If they're waiting for a score versus maybe someone that's coming in that's got kind of all their ducks in a row. So again, the reason why we're talking about all this testing is especially if you have a freshman or a sophomore, this may seem like, well, that's in the future. We don't need to think about it yet. However, if we're now talking about athletes, you actually do start thinking about it earlier because maybe instead of prepping in the fall of your junior year, you're almost thinking summer,
mm-hmm.
between sophomore and junior year, so that you actually take your first test earlier. So, I mean, those are all things working with someone like me. It doesn't have to be me, but someone like me, and with a test prep company that can come up with a good plan for you.
Yeah.
And the other thing to think about too is when is your child's heavy season? So some of them have football in the fall, and then they might have rugby in the spring. The best time to prep is actually in the summer or the winter. So just
Mm,
play around with when is the best time. It doesn't do you any good to do that 20 to 30 hours of prep and they're not even paying attention because they're so swamped with their classes and their sports and all that kind of
mm,
stuff. So definitely kind of like the earlier we can kind of plan out and say, look, like the best time for my student where they can really dedicate themselves, we're spending this money and this time, let's do it right instead of just, oh, let's just do it. Oh, we're going to panic. And now we're doing test prep for like years and years, which is not the goal, right? The goal is for them to be able to do it and like do it well. So kind
mm-hmm.
of set them up in a position where they're doing it in a time frame that's good for them.
Yeah, that is such a great point. So, obviously, when you work with Karen and you have these special deadlines, like that's something that, again, is going to get communicated to us. It's going to get communicated to your director, who's going to be able to set up a plan. So let's say that you give us all that information about your heavy season and then about when that test has to be in, because you need to be one of the first people in, right? You want to have all your ducks in a row. So we could set that up. We have your diagnostic score. We see you want to go up, let's say 100 points. We'll talk to you about your schedule. We'll schedule it out exactly the way it should be. And of course, life comes up. So we can be super flexible as well. But it's 8 to 10 weeks of prep, really. So we can fit that in between your students' schedules. It sounds ominous, but when we break it down like that, like, okay, we've got 10 weeks, how are we going to fit that into your student schedule? That's something that we're really able to do, again, because we have tutors in all different time zones, work 7 days a week. I will say that you will get a tutor match. So we match our tutors to the students' needs and personality. We hand pick our tutors, and you would have the exact same tutor the whole time, because we know through pedagogy that consistency leads to better scores. So just know they wouldn't have a different tutor every time. And then so this is kind of what Karen was saying. So let's talk about the early timeline, because I think that appeals more to this crowd. So the early timeline is kind of what Karen was alluding to, is you're taking your first test that junior year fall. So this is more of a timeline that I think would fit with your
Yep.
group.
Yep.
Yeah. So sophomore year, start your plan. Talk to your advisor. You can sit in with a counselor here at ArborBridge for free, and they're going to set up a whole plan for you. You get to decide whether that's an investment you want to make or not. We also offer you a 30-minute free tutoring session with your tutor, because then you can gauge your students' buy-in. Like, the tutor's going to tell you, like, this is how it went. I think we actually need half the amount of time. Your student's really bought in, or your student's really nervous. There's a lot of anxiety. It might take a little bit longer. So I would say take advantage of all of our free resources to also help set up that really smart test plan. So this is just bringing you so that your student would be done basically with 3 tests, if they needed to take 3, by the spring of their junior year. Oh, that's it. Okay. Do we have any questions? I'm going to put my contact information up as well. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any test questions, and I'll CC Karen on it so that we can all be working as a team.
We don't have any, but I'm gonna go over just a couple basic things just while this is up, while some people might be thinking and kind of like going through lots of the different info.
It's a lot.
So yes, and especially because I was mentioning Jenny, for those who are on live right now, a lot of folks tend to watch this on a rewatch. So I do want to make sure that we have some basic info. For those of us who aren't kind of in this world all the time and are just like, oh my God, ACT, SAT and super school, like all those terms that we kind of throw around, and then they just hear at like a neighborhood barbecue, and now they're totally stressed. So, a couple like big myths that I still continue to hear. So I thought I would address it. And Jenny, please feel free to hop in if you're like, okay, I want to make sure to give some more background.
Sure.
So the one that always comes up is whether or not one test is better than the other. If certain colleges like the SAT or the ACT better. Jenny, what do you think? Do any of the colleges like one or the other?
They don't actually. High schools do. I think you will find a high school that is extremely wedded to one or the other, but colleges accept them both equally.
Yeah. Ding, ding, ding. See, it's like a game show.
Yay!
You get to so yeah, so absolutely that's the reason. I've had some students because they're high school, and a lot of it is maybe because of the state that they live in. So when we were in Colorado, everyone took the SAT. That's the one that's being offered at school, so they just kind of figure that's the one we're taking. And really, they might be leaving some points out on the table if they've
Mhm.
never even tried the ACT. So again, if they've only, if your child's only taken an SAT or that's the one you know about, at least give your child a chance to try it. So, a diagnostic is, there's no pressure. It just kind of gives us a bit of a baseline of what you might score. And for a lot of students, they do find they score better on the ACT, or if they've done the pre-ACT, but they've never tried the SAT, try both of them, right? And see. So a lot of students do better, or even if they don't do better, they actually just like one better.
Mhm.
They like the way that it gets asked, they get the questions better. And look, if you're going to spend 20 plus hours studying, it's like pick the one that they kind of like
Yeah.
in
And
a way.
and yeah, and I just want to kind of reiterate what you said too. We don't suggest that you just sign up for the test and go take it to see which one they like better. We have the free tests. So let them take a free test at the comfort of their home, and they'll be able to tell you, as well as maybe an expert from our company, which test is better from them.
Yeah. Can you share how each of the tests is scored? You mentioned a little bit on the digital how it's kind of adaptive, but what are the like each of the tests scored differently?
Yeah, they're really different. So the SAT, like I said, is an adaptive model. So you have a reading and writing section and you have a math section. Within each of those sections are those modules. So within each section, you start out with a module one and you'll go into a module two, whether that's higher or lower. And each in the reading and writing section, and we're talking about the digital SAT, if I didn't say that, you can score up to 800 points in each of those sections for a perfect score, which would be 1600. So that's how the SAT is scored. The ACT is scored in two different ways. So the classic ACT is a composite of English, reading, math, and science. So those four sections come up with a composite score. The total that you can get on that would be 36. The change to the new one is only going to be a composite score of English, reading, and math, still with a total of 36. If a student chooses to take the optional science, there's also an optional essay with the new one. That's a separate score that goes to the college. So it could say new ACT 32, English, reading, and math, and then science they scored a 18 out of 24, for example. That's how colleges will see that.
Yeah, perfect. So I mean, the reason I bring that up is you might hear one student say they got a 32 and then their friend's like, oh, but I got a 1400. And you're like, well, which one's better? And it's very confusing. If you do look online, and, obviously test prep companies like ArborBridge are going to help you out. There are concordance tables that are available so you can see and you can do a straight comparison of, okay, typically students that are scoring about 1,000 on the SAT are equivalent to an ACT of like a 20 to a 21. So that can
Mhm.
kind of tell you if you took a practice ACT and you got a 29 and you only had 1,000 on the SAT, you know what, the ACT is definitely kind of better. So if you're wondering, can we
Good
kind of
point.
compare two separate tests? You can, because there is a way that they're
Mhm.
kind of, all the data math people, they're kind of figuring out all the data and they're figuring out that these are kind of equivalent scores. And then from the college side, that's what they're looking at too, right? So if they're comparing two different students, one student at this high school took an SAT, this one took an ACT, they are able to compare those two. So that is important for you to know, just kind of don't leave that on the table. Can you talk really, you touched a little bit on receiving the accommodations. Is there any tips for students that is something that they are looking to do? Let's say they're, kind of they're a sophomore now, they're heading into their junior year. How much time or how much leeway, kind of, is there kind of some tips you could give those families?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked because we're seeing such a rise actually in the number of IEPs and 504s. So if you have accommodation, those kinds of words, labels, those kinds of titles should be familiar to you. So we're seeing more and more students with test accommodations. Here's what we suggest. If your student has an IEP or a 504, please make sure that your school counselor is keeping that up to date. So the IEP, according to the ADA laws, has to be revisited every year and has to be updated and signed by teachers. It's very legit. It's kind of meaty. The test companies like them, like they get them and they go, oh, we will give you this accommodation because we have this evidence. That's not so with 504s. So it is on the family to keep the school really having them update that 504 and keep it very evidence-based and up to date. So for example, if your student had a 504 or an IEP from the 8th grade, and now that they're at the end of their junior year and it's never been revisited by students and administrators or counselors, it needs to be up to date. Because if your student needs an accommodation for these tests, please give it to them. It's something that will really help them. But the College Board, which runs the SAT, and ACT that runs the ACT, they're looking for evidence. They could turn you down if there's no evidence that your student may need extra time or a quiet room or text to speech. So that's something that you work with on your school counselor. I'm also happy to answer all those questions. I was once a school counselor, so I can I can answer a lot of those questions. And then I really encourage any family that has a student who has accommodations to go for it, to ask for that. I think it would be important.
Yeah. And I would, the little bit of advice here too is, even if you're not sure, um, whether they're going to get it or not, or that sort of thing. I would at least, if you look on their website, you can literally look up, College Board accommodations, and it's going to come up. It's going to give you a really detailed list of stuff that you have to submit or that your school has to submit. So what I'm trying to say is give yourself some lead time. If you're going to take a test in May, don't start gathering that stuff up today on March 31st, right? We want to start gathering that stuff up early, turn it in early. It can take some time, as you know, right? So like processing lots of paperwork and things like that. So if you know that you have a student that's going to take a test in September, turn it in as early as possible so that they have time to accommodate. And what you're going to find for some students that I've seen is they might get, say, extended time in reading, but they won't get it for math. So different things like that can happen. Don't be surprised. But again, you want to give yourself some time to, then your student knows going into math, they're not getting the extended time, but in reading there are. So then when they're prepping with their tutor, they can prepare for those changes to, whatever accommodation they're going to get.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? I feel like everyone's very quiet, but it's fine. I was just going to mention one other thing I know, and then we'll kind of wrap it up so that we don't keep everyone here too long. Just briefly, if you could touch on test optional, test required, test blind, any of those kind of phrases, because I know that's another and I'm actually, we could probably talk forever about it, but if you can kind
Yes.
of fill some families in on what, what those mean, what that looks like, or any like trends or anything like that that you're seeing, and then I can kind of pop in and say some stuff too.
Yes. So I'll tell you what I know today. And I'll tell you why I say that what I know today, it could change tomorrow. So we're in a really dynamic, for lack of a better word, really dynamic environment right now in higher ed. Schools that were test optional are changing to test required. So let's talk about what that means. Test optional was something that came about from COVID, and it gave students the ability to show their merit for admissions without having to sit for an SAT or ACT, because the test centers weren't open, or it was immunocompromised students couldn't get into the test center. So test optional became this very popular thing for schools. That seems to be going away. Some slowly, some faster. So we're seeing some schools abandon it overnight. And so that's something I think that families have to be aware of. You could be looking at 3 test optional schools today, but I'm just kind of giving you this forewarning that that could change. So our recommendation to most students is just take the test. Just have it in your deck of cards so that you can turn it in if the schools that you have your heart set on decide to go to test required. There are schools that are test blind. Those are still schools that we say take the test, because in all of these cases, admissions people are sitting down with all of the student applications and they're comparing students, right? So why not have the test? There's always a reason not to, and there's always a reason to go test blind or test optional, because some students just do not test well. So there is a case for that. I'm just saying, stay on that school website, stay on the admissions website, be mindful that those things can change. And, I know that I'm kind of a nerd in the test prep world, but I say just have that test at least in your back pocket.
Yeah. And the thing I'll mention is so for families, if you're like, ooh, I don't really know with this whole testing thing, most of my families have a mixed list, right? So like a lot of them will have a handful of University of California schools, which are test blind that don't require any tests. They might have a handful that are test optional, and then they have a handful that are test required. So what happens there is, the ones that are required, you're going to send them, whether they're kind of quote good enough or not, they just kind of have to send them. They'll send the best score that they have. They might have the, set of colleges where, some of them, like they're kind of on the fence. It's not super strong, and some where they're really strong. So you can pick and choose. When it's test optional, if I was applying to a school, I could say, I'm going to send my best score that I have, which is a 1200 on the SAT. I'm going to send it to these 2 schools, which is, right within their range of test scores. And for these 2 schools that are optional, where I'm kind of below what their range is, I just wouldn't send it. So at that point, families always ask me, well, but if we don't send it, they'll know that it's bad. And I'm like, no, the point is, if you don't send it, you're not penalized for it. You just don't get the extra points. You don't get the added bonus of having them there. They're not there to help you, right? But it doesn't hurt you in that manner. So they don't automatically go,
Right.
oh, you don't have a score, like you must have done really bad. The point of test optional is for you to make that choice of, look, like I did really well. I do want to submit it. I didn't do well. I don't want to submit it at all. Because some students also still are just like, I don't want to test, or maybe they are in California where the majority of state schools are test blind. They're like, I'm just not going to take it anyway. I just last minute decided to apply to this school and I don't even have a test.
Yeah.
So you do have some flexibility. I mean, the nice thing about, since the pandemic and having those tests optional and some flexible things in there, some students are able to shine a bit more in some other areas of their application. I think
Mm-hmm.
some students are very excited to see testing come back, the ones that actually are better at testing and maybe not as good as things like writing essays or, kind of expressing themselves a certain way. They're actually very, very good at kind of all the kind of basic like testing pieces or whatever. So it kind of helps everybody in a way for now, but kind of like what Jenny's saying, you want to make sure that you're staying on top of those things. That's part of my job, as part of Jenny's job is we stay on top of these things and know what's going on so that when we're meeting with our families, we're giving them the most up-to-date session. I mean, I did this webinar when we were kind of talking about this a year ago, and that was literally when we were saying, this is the new digital SAT. And it's like, that was brand new. And now we've had this on our belt. And now it's like, wait, here is a new digital ACT now. So, I mean, you are going to see changes continue. Look, it's all those two testing companies are kind of going head to head all the time. They're fighting for their market share. They're going to be making changes. Unfortunately, the people that are most affected are high school students. So they just kind of have to figure out ways to get through it and not get super, super confused. And so that's part of our job is to help. And as parents, if you find that you are struggling with kind of wading through all of this, talk to your high school, your school, your child's school counselor, talk to someone like me, talk to someone like Jenny, like find people that are like involved in this industry so we can give you some, unbiased opinion about this is what we think you need. I mean, the other thing that I'm going to point out, I could go on and on about this. A lot of our recommendations about testing, about GPA, about curriculum, all those things, it's always in the context of where your child is looking to apply or where they want to go. Because I have students, their list might look like, for example, University of Arizona, Arizona State, Western Washington, and Utah, right? Let's just take those four. The admission rate at those schools are 80 to 90% acceptance rate. Okay, so they're not very selective. They're fairly open. Again, it doesn't mean anything bad about the school. It's the way that this school has decided to choose the way that they're going to select students. When we look at those schools, does a student need a 36 to get into University of Utah? No, right? If you look at the range of scores, those are the scores that we're aiming for, not a perfect 36. If I have a student that comes to me and says, well, I'm aiming for schools like Caltech, MIT, Stanford, Vanderbilt, Rice, schools of that caliber. Now we are looking at, wow, the range of students that are applying and getting in to those schools are now ACT scores 33 to 36, SAT somewhere 1510 to 1800, right? So at that point, the scores that were okay for a Utah and a Western Washington are not going to be okay for these schools, right? And again, I'm saying it broadly because I'm sure someone's going to be like, but what about that one person I know? And you never know. That's the other thing too, is I want to throw out, you will like randomly be at a barbecue and you'll hear someone say, but I knew this one person who got into that school who didn't have that score. But then I would ask, I'd be curious if that student didn't have the academic profile that is typical of that school. What was the thing that made them stand out? Were they, like a internationally renowned prima ballerina by the time they were 15, right? Or they're going to be doing something extra special if the extra special piece isn't, kind of in their grades or in their testing. So before everyone comes at me about that I want to throw that one out there, is that it is important to understand the context of where your child is kind of aiming, what kind of major they're aiming for. That will affect kind of what kind of scores we're actually shooting for. There's no point having, Jenny work with, well, let's do 50 hours of test prep and do all this when your child's maybe just a hair shy of the scores they really need to feel comfortable applying to those schools. And any other pieces, any final thoughts? Those are kind of my little things I want to make sure to throw in there so families hear that from me.
And that's so important. It is, and that's why we work so closely together with Karen, is that we'll know the scores that you need. And if it's so small, maybe we'll just show you how to use the Desmos calculator, and that's all you need. And we could be really, really strategic about what score you need. So that is such an important component to come into. And then, the other thing I would say is that GPA, you're going to see a lot of this in the news lately. Like GPAs aren't equal between all states, right? They just, a 4.0 in California might be different from a 4.0 in Texas. They're just different. And so they are relying on these tests, on this data to compare the students a little bit more equally, if that makes sense. Even if it's a lower score, right? Even if it's a school that doesn't require a high standardized test score, but you feel like your students' GPA might not reflect their true potential, then the test is really something that's kind of even ground for all states.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Well, we have, we allowed some time for question and answer here, but it doesn't look like anyone has any.
We answered
I
everything.
know. We did such a good just pat ourselves on the back.
Yay!
So what I'm going to do just to kind of wrap things up first. So for those of you who did join us live, I will send you kind of a little follow-up wrap-up email here. You will see this recording on the online resources page that's on my website. And I'll make sure when that email goes out, we'll include Jenny's contact information as well. Or you can always reach out to me, Karen@ruggersedge.com, and I can connect you to the best people to help you kind of wade your way through all of this test prep stuff. And then obviously, if you're on the online content page, take a look at any of the other, webinars and sessions that I've done to help you kind of understand college recruiting, college rugby, what does that look like? Anything from how to make the best highlight films to, things like, helping your student with their like mental grit when they're on the field. So there's just some really cool people I've talked to, and I love sharing that information to students. I want to thank Jenny for joining us this evening.